Welcome, Panu Pihkala. Good to see you. How are you doing?
Thank you, Paul. Very good to see you. It's been a while, and greetings from Helsinki, Finland. It's a sunny early summer's day here.
Well, that's great. You're looking great. And I'm delighted that we can have this conversation about climate anxiety. And let me just tell those who are partners in this program a little bit about you. You're a climate anxiety researcher at the University of Helsinki. You've also been active in studying ecological and theological matters for a long time, and you are married and have two children.
Oh, yes.
Is that right? And how old are they?
They are now 7 and 10.
Okay. Well, I want to dive right in, but I want to know publicly a little more about you. Could you tell us about your religious background and how you got into theology in the first place?
Yes, thanks for asking. I grew up in Finland. We are a country quite far in Northern Europe. Luckily, the Gulf Stream has kept us warm, at least until now, but let's see in the future. It's been a very safe place to grow up, and I also benefited from that. And it was very Lutheran, the folk church or the people's church style. I think it was Christian Stendhal who sometimes said that for Scandinavians, the church is like a post office. You don't go there every week, but it's very important that it's there. And that sort of reflects things in the town where I grew up. So 95% were Lutherans, but most of them went to church on Christmas and then for the family celebrations and so on. And my mother had her own piety, and I had mine also from very, very early on. But a sort of quite, one could say, culture and nature-oriented version of Lutheranism.
Uh-huh. That was then, and this is now. All of us are much concerned about you being in Finland, and Finland is right next to Russia. And how has the war changed your life in Finland, or perhaps it hasn't?
Thanks for asking. And there's a long and complicated history between Finland and Russia and Soviet Union. So a lot of older people still remember Second World War, and the sort of psychological effect of a threat from an attack from the east is part of the national psyche in Finland. And there's been lots of good trade relations and cultural relations also between Russia and Finland, especially in the last 40 years or so. But then, of course, the war in Ukraine has raised all those old fears, and there was lots of shock and anxiety when the war began. Now, many Finns, including me, have adjusted. So, of course, there are risks, but we don't feel imminent risk. And it has resulted in Finland joining the NATO, for example. So it has had strong impacts on Finnish society.
So you're living in a situation which is not a surprise to you, because the presence of the Soviet Union has been a dominating fact in Finnish history for a while. Let me ask you a little more about your own personal history. When did you begin to get interested in matters theological and ecological? Tell me about that.
I think some of the foundations are in experiences as a child and a young person. So I think that sort of what is sometimes nowadays called lived theology is much there. But then for more cognitive engagement with theology, especially after the age of 15 years, when the Finnish Lutheran Church has this system of confirmation school camps at campsites near nature. That was impactful for me, and I became a volunteer in the local congregation, and then after finishing high school went in a sort of pilgrimage around Europe, which then led to some spiritual seeking also, and confirmed that I want to know more about theology and religion, and enroll or apply to the Faculty of Theology. And then steadily, sort of the vocational call to be an ordained minister also grew. So that was my history, which I worked as a parish pastor for 5 years after I graduated. And before that, I did my master's thesis about environmental theology in 2004 and 5, studying Lutheran World Federation and environmental issues in the 1980s. And that sort of paved the way for my dissertation in early 2010s, which led me into contact with you also, and your generous support both in ideas and motivation for studying more about the history of Christian environmental thought.
The issue of climate anxiety is one that I know has taken hold of you and your consciousness and your sort of vocational self-understanding in recent years. How did that begin to claim you as the driving concern of your vocational existence?
That's a good formulation, because I really think it's related to felt vocations. And in the late 2000s, we started noticing together with colleagues in environmental education that people of all ages, especially adults, have lots of feelings about the ecological crisis. But these were very rarely, if ever, talked about publicly, and there was very little research about them also. So that led me into both a practical interest, because I saw that these emotions are affecting people, and then to an academic interest, that why is there so little research about this? And then when I was doing my dissertation, I also gathered material related to ecological emotions and climate anxiety, and then started focusing on that after my PhD years began. But it was really because I saw the relevance, and because there wasn't much else people doing that. So I also sort of felt called to do that, and I had some possibilities to do it. I had to use some deviousness and motivation, because it wasn't easy to get research funding for eco-anxiety in 2015. Everybody thought I was crazy or just gloomy Slavic person to do this.
As you proceeded into the depths of this field and really been a leader in this field, have you noticed differences in different groups of people, let's say older generation, younger generation? Is everyone anxious about climate, or what's going on in the world as you see it?
That's a very good question, or a set of questions. And we heard where we care is of course one way to go into the fundamentals. That people who care about the state of the planet, they have then the high possibility to feel worry, sometimes fear, sometimes anxiety. And much of my interdisciplinary academic work has been an effort to clarify that what do we actually mean or could mean with the concepts such as eco-anxiety and climate anxiety and climate grief and so on. So it's not just strong anxiety states, but also more like anxiety emotions, where we feel a problem and then we start wondering about what should we do about this problem, which is big and includes some unpredictability. So there is a very adaptive dimension into eco-anxiety also, but then of course in many times it can be so strong and paralyzing that it becomes a problem. And this all affects the question of who feels it. So many of the most vocal people who speak about eco-anxiety are young people and young adults, and they have their future ahead of them. and many of them have strong environmental values and they have empathy. You know, young people from generation to generation have often been sensitive to issues of justice, for example. So there is this generational dynamic, but of course also the ecological crisis has become so severe that that very severity itself captivates people. But then environmental researchers, environmental activists, sometimes educators for many reasons, people living close to the land, so indigenous people, fishers, hunters. So there's plenty of factors which can cause a person to be more affected by this than others.
I want to ask you a follow-up pastoral question. Over here in this capitalist society, many people are in the churches, by my perception, are in a state of denial. And it's difficult for pastors who are, many of whom are very much taken by these issues and want to help their people deal with them when the people don't want to deal with them.
Mm-hmm.
They just want to do their job and get their vacation time and be good parents and all those kinds of things. What sort of counsel would you give to pastors as to how do you begin to broach this subject, and how do you deal with what I take to be some anger too?
Mm-hmm.
What counsel could you give to pastors in that kind of situation?
First of all, I think it's a matter where one should have appreciation towards oneself if you are sensitive about this. It's already very valuable if somebody cares about this and wants to do something constructive about that. And that's an achievement in dealing with ambiguity and difficulty. And then with various people, understanding some of the dynamics behind what seems like denial or disavowal and sometimes apathy, that can be useful. By, for example, noticing that for many people, this is such an existential threat that they resort to these defenses of denial and distancing and so on. So that can sometimes increase compassion and determination, and many times one has to go sort of around the corner. So not have an explicit sermon about eco-anxiety, but rather try to approach the subject from another angle and perhaps go to these emotional and psychosocial dilemmas that people are feeling. So trying to build a sort of safe space or container, to use some language from psychology, so that people would dare to encounter these kinds of very difficult truths. I know it's not easy, and we can look for historical comparisons, for example, with racism. That wasn't an easy subject either for pastors to speak about.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your own experience, I know that you have not just been a student of these matters sitting behind a desk, but you also have been on various kinds of encounters with the wider world, God's wider world of creation, and explored the beautiful land of Finland, not just yourself, but with others. What role do you think a kind of more personal encounter with God's good earth could play to help people begin to deal with some of these climate anxiety issues? Maybe.
Yes, and personally, it's a great source of strength and rejuvenation to be able to be in touch with the modern human world. But I also know that for some people who are very struck by eco-anxiety, they may see signs and triggers of ecological anxiety when they go out to nature, for example. So that's a real issue that sometimes we have to work through a kind of threshold so that people would again find a way to receive that strength and rejuvenation we can get from the modern human world. And of course, there's so much out there, and many things can testify to the persistence of life, for example, and the continuity of life even among significant hardship.
It occurs to me as you speak that although we here in the U.S. Often tend to become romantic about nature and think of it as in terms of beautiful oil paintings and scenic views and things like this, that one of the things that happens when people enter into what we call nature with open eyes is that you see a lot of destruction. You see pollution. You see the people of the earth being driven out. How has the church in Finland responded to some of these larger issues, and what might you tell us to help us on our side of the world?
There's definitely some leaders in America also, so I think it's a sort of two-way situation, that there's things we need to learn in Finland from the States and other way around. And of course, this ability to be in touch both with the suffering in the world and in the sources of hope and joy in the world, that's very, very, very crucial. The Church of Finland, among other churches, it has been quite progressive in environmental matters and sometimes also in relation to ecological emotions. Many of the people in the church know me, and that has helped also for them to engage with my work and then work of others in Finland. But also for many of them, the situation has difficulties, and because it's really a severe situation in which we are living, I think that as Christians, we sometimes have the temptation to sort of a bit hide behind God's mercy and grace and sort of overemphasize the belief that God will take care of this. And of course, there is always hope because God is with us. And on one level, these are, of course, true statements in theology, but we need sensitivity and sensibility to the gravity of the situation. And this is very crucial also for pastoral encounters with young people who feel eco-anxiety, for example.
Are theological students these days, in your knowledge, wrestling with these issues? I mean, is there a place beyond in seminaries that is beyond learning the Bible, learning the tradition, and learning how to counsel people in moments of individual crisis? Is the church doing enough, or maybe it's doing a lot, to help its members, in particular its pastoral leaders, to help others with climate anxiety?
Well, I think that there's much more to be done, but there are some good steps which have been taken. And I'm doing a training session 3 or 4 times a year as part of the continuing education of clergy in Finland. And there we discuss eco-emotions and eco-anxiety and the different contexts. You know, if you are a countryside pastor, climate issues tend to feature a bit differently in the social sphere. And so it goes into all this psychosocial difficulty which may happen in pastoral care. Students and then educators are starting to deal with this in Christian education, a bit in liturgy, but overall I think that in the spiritual life and liturgy, much more could be done in relation to this.
Talk off the top of your head about and answer your own question there. Much more could be done about this. What sort of things come into your mind? Fantasize a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
You could see things happening in the church. What would you like to see happening?
Yeah, I think there's a need for both proactive and reactive skills. So reactive, I'd like Christian people to have sensitivity to these issues. So when they or the people near to them manifest these kinds of difficult emotions, they would be able to listen and validate and be with it. But then proactively, I think that we have the liturgical year, for example. We have theme days for gratitude about God's creation, for example. I think we should explore also thematic days for several difficult eco-emotions, like guilt, for example, or even shame. And then, of course, fear and anxiety and grief. So there's a lot of this Christian wisdom gathered over the centuries that we could apply to this. And for example, if there's an intercession period at a service, there might be one intercession altar which explicitly deals with ecological issues. So it's not just the special theme days, but it would be present also in the overall worship life. And then some special events like Ash Wednesday offer a chance to sort of collectively face issues, and that moves away from overly individualizing tendencies. And that's very important, for example, to alleviating over strong forms of climate guilt, for example.
Now you have 2 young children. How old are they again?
7 and 10, so they are in school now, both of them.
And I was reading the paper the other day that there's a noticeable tendency, at least over here, for people who get married to discuss whether to have children, and for those who do have children, just wondering, how do you begin to, I mean, just getting through the day is sometimes a big challenge, and yet we're now living in a world which is in crisis. How do you begin to talk to your children about this? Or maybe you don't talk, maybe you do other things. What's been your experience with your own children?
I think a very fundamental issue is basic safety or trust. And of course, in Finland, we live in privileged contexts, so that it's more easily attainable than in some other places. But, if the children feel loved for and cared for, and if they have the feeling that they can talk about their emotions to parents, I think that's already a lot. And my sons, I've heard them talk about environmental issues so that they don't hear me listening. And what they often say is that, my father works full time with these environmental issues, so they take comfort that the family is sort of in it, and that's of course another privilege. And I know there's a lot of different good works and positions, and not everybody gets off this easily. That your whole work life sort of contributes or tries to contribute to these things. But that's also important that the children get the feeling that somehow our family or extended family is engaged.
Now, I'll let you off the hook a little bit on this as a personal issue, but as a broader social issue, the church is dealing with all sorts of concerns. And in my own church, we're dealing with issues of sexual identity, a range of issues of in our own area of racism. How and hovering around it all are all these earth crisis issues. How do you begin to sort of take the next step? I mean, you can't do everything at once. What's been your experience?
Yeah, that's of course very true, and some people use the word polycrisis to refer to how many crises there are, and one can't choose the time in which one lives. And of course, sometimes historical reflection can be a bit comforting, realizing that people, including Christians, have lived in very difficult times also before, and then trying to think about that what kind of ways of living helped them at least to find a way to the next day among the difficult periods. But everything, as you say, happens inside this ecological great system. So there are plenty of very, very important issues. But of course, if the ship in which we are starts to be damaged or even sinking, that has quite high priority.
Why are we smiling?
That's one psychological defense, of course. So yeah,
it is, and there's something to it. I mean that two brothers in Christ sharing things that are just wrenching. We can smile about it. There may be something theological in that. What do you think?
I think that's a very good observation, and it would be totally out of place if we wouldn't have sensitivity to sadness and angst also. But if that is present, then I think, that's part of life, and black humor helped many people to get through the Soviet Union era, the ordinary citizens, for example. And I think that's one tool we have to use also.
So Pastor Pihkala, when you shock me in the pulpit when you say, you should tell jokes, you should not, and I think there's something serious about it, that we are not totally overwhelmed by this. There is hope, and I come back to that at the end of this conversation. Here, there, everywhere, the issue of hope emerges, and how do you sort of begin to or deal with this sort of on a daily basis? How do you keep hope alive, Panu?
I think hope again is something which is really lived. So there's all this cognitive work around various conceptions of hope, and Ernst Bloch writing thousands of pages of philosophy and hope and that sort of thing, which is very familiar for us systematic theologians. But your question is right to the point, that how do we actually live it through? And there, I think the concept of meaning is highly intertwined with hope. So if we can experience enough meaning in our everyday life, and I mean by enough that you have some grit or some reason to get it through to the next day. So there is some hope there also, even when the emotion might be closer to despair sometimes. But for signs of hope and vitality, of course, there are plenty of them still. And one important thing is to be aware of how the news cycle, for example, affects us. So that's one very practical skill, that I think we have to limit the exposure to threatening news. We shouldn't hide from them completely, but if we only follow that, our nervous system becomes too worried, and we lose sight of also or what I've sometimes called in Finland, the unaccountable goodness of everyday life.
So today is a blessing.
Exactly.
It is. And I want to thank you for participating in this conversation. It will be shared with a whole range of people here in the U.S. And I want to also thank you for your scholarship and your ministry. I think how do I know this? That one of your works has been opened up 40,000 times online. So the word is getting out, but it's good to have these personal one-to-one conversations as kind of the bedrock for doing the larger things. And I thank you for your ministry, and thank you for participating in this conversation. I'll say goodbye to you now, Panu. So good to see you face to face.
Thank you so much, Paul, and also for everything you do.